Crooked River, Chapter 32. The jury deliberated inside Mr. Perry's store. The next day. As the noonday hour crept closer, people began to gather outside the store, waiting to hear the outcome. More than a few of the men had brought their jugs of whiskey to toast the death of the Indian, they said, but I prayed hard they were going to be proved wrong. Me and Laura sat on a blanket in the shadow of the store near Mr. Perry's woodpile. Mercy played with her yarn doll next to us. He's innocent, and the jury will see that, won't they? I whispered to Laura for the 100th time, and she said she hoped they would. Mrs. Holly came over and settled down next to us with her new little baby. It's a trying day, isn't it? Mrs. Holly sighed, waiting for all the men. She smoothed her baby's straw-colored hair. He was a scrawny, squalling little thing. Even in front of kind-hearted Mrs. Holly, me and Laura didn't dare to say what we thought about the trial. We just nodded politely and said it was a long wait, especially with all the work left to be done. Mrs. Holly cast a look toward the store and shook her head. I wish my husband wasn't even on that jury. He doesn't have any grudges against the Indians, she said softly. It's the white man's word against the Indian's word. That's what my husband says. And who can decide which one to believe or what to do? I wondered if Mrs. Holly's husband believed Indian John was innocent. Mr. Holly was a quiet sort of man who seemed to do more thinking than most folks, so I hoped that he did. Glancing over at Mercy, Mrs. Holly turned her words to another direction. Your little sister's growing up real fast, isn't she? She said, and we agreed that she was. When it was past noon, the doors of Mr. Perry's store finally opened. The whole crowd outside the store fell silent, seeing the jurymen come out of the building one by one. I watched the men walk to the row of planks that had been set up for them as seats. The men didn't look to the right or left, but kept their eyes to the ground in the hushed silence. Mrs. Holly's baby started screaming, and a trembling chill began inside me. Judge James R. Noble and the sheriff followed the jury. The judge's black robes flapped around him like dark crow's wings. Close behind him came Augustus Root and Peter Kelly. At the sight of Peter Kelly's pale and drawn face, Laura's hand flew to cover her mouth, and my throat tightened as if I would be sick. Mr. Kelly paused next to the judge's table with Augustus Root, and I could see his hands rolling and unrolling the brim of the hat he held. His face was the color of ashes. One of the jurymen walked over and gave the sheriff a piece of paper, and the sheriff carried it to the judge. I don't recollect what the sheriff said, but I won't ever forget what Judge Noble did afterward. He looked at the jurymen and told them to pronounce their verdict to the crowd. My heart hammered in my chest. Each of the 12 men stood up one by one. The Hoadley brothers slouched and grinned as they said, "Guilty, guilty." Vinegar Bigger took off his old hat, pressed it to his chest, and mumbled, "Guilty." Guilty. Only Mr. Holly paused a moment and looked out at the crowd before he said softly, "I believe he is guilty." Peter Kelly's voice nearly broke as he jumped up right after Mr. Holly and shouted, "Your Honor, the counsel please requests a new trial. The jury hasn't fairly considered." But Judge Noble shook his head. The good men of this jury, he glanced toward the men, under tremendous responsibility, have duly weighed all the evidence. They have deliberated carefully, and they have found the Indian called John Amick guilty of murder in the 1st degree. "But, Your Honor," Peter Kelly's voice rose. "Mr. Kelly," the judge warned, "the evidence was not—" The judge leaned across his table. "Mr. Kelly," his voice thundered, "the verdict has been decided. The defendant is guilty, and the sentence will now be read." As some of the men brought Indian John to stand in front of the judge, my ears throbbed and my head spun as if I would soon faint away. The judge leaned forward, fixing his eyes on Indian John. "You, John Amick, have been found guilty of the crime of murder. Do you understand that?" the judge said, and the interpreter, John Bigson, repeated the words. "The laws of God and man attach the penalty of death to the crime of murder. Indian John did not move. The judge continued, "You, John Amick, are no longer fit to live with the white man, and it is my duty to tell you that your time is fixed upon this earth. The court will allow you little more than a week's time to prepare for another world, and to receive one visit from a representative of your people." Standing up, the judge picked up a piece of paper and read in a loud voice, which echoed across the silent crowd. "It is therefore the sentence of this court that on the 16th day of June, about 1 week hence, between the hours of 10 o'clock in the morning and noon, the Indian John Amick will be taken thence to the place of execution and hanged about the neck until he is dead." And as the crowd stood and cheered around me, and someone threw an egg at the front of Peter Kelly, I grabbed the cloth of my skirt in one hand, turned on my heels, and ran. I do not understand. Guilty, 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 guilty. I tell Red Hair, I have always stood in the smoke between our people. I have not struck the Geechee Mukaman in their lodges while they sleep, and I have overlooked their foolishness, the foolishness of those who would offend me. To you, Red Hair, I have been a protector, a brother. You will be sorry when I leave you, I say. I tell Red Hair, I feel no fear of death, but I do not understand guilty.